10 miles from the town of Dramos are the remains of a once mighty tower of Niz the Inscrutable. Huge blocks of granite and marble give evidence to the structure that once towered 100 feet over the rocky cliffs along the Bay of Talus that was destroyed in a huge explosion 100 years ago. But the great wizard Niz left behind more than just rubble. For beneath her great keep, she had constructed a massive dungeon, reputed to be at least 10 levels of chambers, hallways, and pits. Niz's dungeon had attracted treasure seekers almost from the moment she disappeared in the conflagration that destroyed her lavish keep. But it was also a place greatly feared, for the various chambers and winding corridors were known to be host to evil creatures. It was said that behind every door in Niz's labyrinth was a terror more horrible than the last, and the deeper one dove, the more deadly the foes. Worse yet, those who attempted to go down to the fabled lowest level were said to have been overwhelmed by an endless supply of denizens, almost as though they were being produced by some infernal machine. The rumors and legends about Niz's dungeons were said to be as numerous as the terrible creatures that dwelt there, with tales of constructs constantly digging out new levels and rooms, with creatures that needed no sustenance, just waiting for those reckless enough to stumble upon them. For this place was not merely a great work of stone, mortar, and brick. It was the ultimate example of the D&D dungeon cliché. Hello again, gang. KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So this is a video in the continuing series on D&D clichés, and as I mentioned in an earlier video on taverns, it's also an homage to these cliches, because they form some of the great storytelling and game mechanic building blocks of the game. And so these curious underground labyrinths that often make no practical sense are an integral part of the lore of D&D and the playing experience. Now here's the thing, I love dungeons. Part of it is that my introduction to the game of D&D was playing in dungeons. Part of it is the storytelling possibilities that come with discovering, underground dungeon or cave complex. But also the unique, restrictions, limitations, and opportunities that come with operating, and conducting battles and whatnot in an underground environment. They're rife with possibilities. So I'm going to go over 5 classic dungeon cliches. I'm going to talk about, the truisms that brought them about and how you as a GM can sort of, sand off the cliched edges and hackneyed things and find the good parts of what made those cliches come about in the first place. First, the dungeon that no one would ever build, a monster around every corner and behind every door. The deeper you go, the deadlier the monsters you encounter. The infinite monster generator. And finally, attempts to create a dungeon ecology. So here is one of the first dungeons that I ever drew. I was 12 years old, my first attempt. And as you can see, it is just hallways, rooms, more hallways, more rooms. And each of these contains a monster just waiting for the players to get involved. So there is an inherent question of verisimilitude, which asks, why would someone make the great effort and expense to dig out such a vast network of tunnels and rooms and multiple layers versus the reality of a kid with a paper and pencil sitting in his room drawing it? And we became even more conscious of the absurdity of this sort of thing as you moved to lower levels and you had to wind your way from one end of the dungeon to the next to find the entrance to the next level, which meant leaving you had to do that. And sometimes you had, secret doors or elevators or this or that. Why would someone make it so difficult to move from level to level? Now, in my, heyday of dungeon making, let's say 16, 17, I thought that I had come up with the novel concept. I created here a circular stairway. And this stairway ran down all 12 levels of my mega dungeon. So that when you were high enough, you'd just get on the stairs, you'd go down the stairs to, say, level 6 to fight monsters there. But still, each level contained, a highly complicated series of rooms, oddly built, sloping chambers and hallways, things that nobody would really take the time and effort to build. So what happened was people began to create, 5 or 6 room, single level dungeons, beneath temples or keeps or guilds that made sense in terms of functionality. They were used for storage, maybe holding some prisoners, conducting secret rites, that sort of thing. And I did this as well. And in fact, the sample tomb that I, used in one of my videos with Dungeon Draft, it had a couple of main rooms, some side rooms. I had a little cavern with a pool in it, very small and contained. But you notice I did create in the sacrifice chamber, whatever, a pool, and suggested that it could be connected to a network of passages. And I did this because what happens with players when they see something like this, they're always interested in is there more to this? Could this be connected to some underground cavern complex, maybe that no one has explored in a while? And the reason for this, of course, is that the mega dungeon concept, especially one that has never been explored or not in a long time, is very attractive to players. So what I say is, you can revive this sort of dungeon that no one would build or mega elaborate if you come up with a storyline for why it makes sense. And if you do this, your players will love it. So we have a tradition in architecture of the architectural folly built by some, eccentric rich person where, doesn't make sense in terms of the rooms and this and that. Well, why not in D&D? Why not a mad wizard or some demigod or whatever who builds some elaborate underground complex merely as a testament to their genius and power? Or an artifact that creates constructs who dig out areas and put up mortar and everything simply to show its power over inert matter. And it's perfectly reasonable for a cave complex that has been, worn away by thousands of years of running water to have all sorts of, twisting passages, some small, narrow, chutes that run down, pools of water. And creatures could discover these. Not only could they live there and inhabit, they could enlarge them or create other areas to, more developed. All right, so the second cliche, in which there's a monster in every nook and cranny of a dungeon, strikes us as, hackneyed, a cliche, because it's clear that they're just there waiting for the players to arrive. They don't live there, they don't interact with one another. And this is even more striking when you have creatures crammed into a room, 6 trolls that are in a 30 by 30 foot room, and they're doing what? Waiting for the players. And here again, the traditional answer, the limited, simple dungeon, will typically have one type of creature, maybe 2, which again seems reasonable and realistic, but can be a little boring. Think of creative ways in which you can have a whole variety of monsters, NPCs or whatever, that are living in a larger dungeon complex and interacting somehow in some way that makes sense. Maybe they each have carved out a neighborhood or their turf within this complex, and they, protect this and allow others to protect theirs. There can also be some aspect of a dungeon or cave complex which attracts a variety of creatures. It might be some magic aura, arcane or divine magic, which gives sustenance to creatures such that they will tolerate each other, in ways they wouldn't ordinarily. Think of a food source where you have animals that come to a food source or water source and there's kind of a truce there. So what this gives the players is a challenge that makes sense. Whether they're going there to find some item or, solve some mystery, whether they're going there to turn off this aura or something or find the artifact, they know they're going to run into a whole host of creatures that you can mix and match. And if they're there to, do something to this aura, these creatures are going to resist them. They need this sustenance. So the idea that the deeper you go into a multi-level dungeon, the more deadly the creatures are, is derived, largely the box set had a set of, random monster tables appearing, and that's basically how it worked. And this was based on the concept of levels in terms of the character classes. But it's also in the tradition, Lord of the Rings, the dwarves in the mines of Moria, dove too deep, and they unleashed the Balrog from somewhere deep in the earth. But, one of the problems with this makes it kind of cliched is that if you think about a dungeon, why would the most powerful creatures live in the basement? You would think they would live on the levels closer to the surface. They have easier access to the outside world, easier to escape or get back in, but also they would be the first to encounter anyone who enters the dungeon and therefore, take their stuff or eat them. So again, as always, this points to having a single level, a simplified dungeon, which basically acts as a lair where the creatures can live and then conduct raids. But I think you can have some fun with some super powerful creatures that do live on the lowest levels of a dungeon complex if you're creative about how they might, handle the getting inside and out, an access that is only available to them. So imagine a super ancient red dragon who lives far beneath this dungeon complex, but it has a chute that runs up all the way to the top of the mountain, perhaps through a volcano, right? Something that's easy for the red dragon to get in and out of, but very difficult for anyone else. You can have mind flayers and liches that have a complex deep beneath a dungeon, and they have teleport circles and whatnot that allow them to travel back and forth. The players might be able to fight their way through all the other levels to get to the mind flayers and liches if so they choose, or they can figure out the secrets of the teleport circles. So again, these creatures are using the monsters that are all the levels above them to protect themselves. And in fact, these creatures may be working for them, enslaved by them, worshiping them, whatever. All right, so then you have the infinite monster generator cliche, which basically states that, you go into a dungeon and you go down levels and you're clearing out every room and searching, and maybe you rest for a few days or whatever. And then when you come back, all the rooms are filled with monsters again. Where do they come from? And in the old days, we used to have random monster rolls where every 60 feet you rolled for a random monster, and 1 out of 6 chance you'd run into them. And this was whether you were going forward or coming backwards. Again, we just went through this whole dungeon, we cleared everything out, now we're coming back and there's a random monster. Where is it coming from? So the thing was, again, with the simple dungeon, whether it was 1 or 2 levels and a limited number of rooms, you'd put the monsters in there, the players go in, they clear it out, and that's it. Or if you had a mega dungeon or whatever, you had vast areas with no monsters in them because it didn't seem realistic. But again, realism becomes the cliche of reasonableness or over verisimilitude, however you want to describe it. It is a fantasy game, we're trying to have fun. So think of a storyline as to why a certain mega dungeon that you're building has this infinite monster thing. There might be some kind of portal or gate, perhaps a nexus point between planes, and maybe it's out of whack or something, and suddenly creatures are being randomly teleported into this dungeon complex. Maybe that's the reason the players are there, to try to turn this off. It's creating an imbalance between the various planes. The point is, when the players are being tasked to do this, to go deep within this mega dungeon and turn this off, they know they could be running into anything, anywhere, and that can be fun. And then, of course, we have the grand attempt to resolve all of the nonsensical cliches of classic dungeon building, which became in itself a cliche, which was the attempt to create an ecological framework to explain, why creatures are living in a dungeon. It was the attempt to justify how things can, find food and water, sunlight if they need it, and this sort of thing. So it isn't just, goblins or drow, things that are suited to living underground, but the attempt is made to justify anything. So you had huge caverns with, fungi or crystals that provided lighting. They were so big that they had an atmosphere through which you could have rainfall, right? You could even have a fake sky. The rainfall could cause, plants and even crops to grow. You had underground rivers that flowed into vast lakes, even oceans. And the idea here was you could create societies of humanoids living here that would ordinarily be existing on the surface. The problem here was that you were always creating in these underground societies made up of humanoids or creatures that don't ordinarily live underground, a sort of stilted and artificial environment. The thing is, even in the Stone Age, very few people chose to live in caves. Caves were dark, they were damp, and they had all sorts of creatures, cave bears and cave lions and that sort of thing, dire wolves or whatever, that competed with them to live in caves. So when something is inherently artificial in its inception, it becomes in its execution often cliched and hackneyed. The players kind of see through this. Unless you can come up with a storyline and sort of scenario where it makes sense. So just as you have certain humanoids that have origin stories as to how they became underground, the drow being banished to the Underdark, or the Drugar who, are infused with its magic after their years of servitude to the Mind Flayers, right? You can come up with origin stories for creatures that we don't ordinarily think of living underground. So you might have a village that was sent into a planar sort of bubble in which the village was sustained. Maybe this was a punishment. Maybe the idea was to protect them from some force, whatever. Maybe whoever did this died before they could bring them back. Maybe the people did it themselves and either chose not to or didn't have the power to. But notice what you're doing here is you are creating an underground environment with an ecology that would sustain non-typical underground creatures, but you're limiting it in its scope. And it doesn't have to be contained in a planar bubble through which you have to teleport. Presumably nobody in the village can do this. You can have such a thing where you can get to it through some series of incredibly complicated tunnels or whatever, but it should be really difficult. And I think there should be a very compelling reason why the inhabitants are not going to the surface if there's a way out. Because here's the thing, even if, their eyes have now, sunlight hurts them, or they have no pigments in their skin for direct sunlight. The thing is, creatures that evolve to live on the surface, if they have a chance to, are going to want to live on the surface. They're probably going to say, it might be tough for me, but my children or my children's children will evolve, their eyes will go back or whatever, they'll get used to the sunlight. They're going to want to live above ground. So who's going to help them return to the place they should really live? The player character. So there you have some cliched dungeon tropes that you can actually alter, bend, sand, however you want to do it, make some twists to, and apply it to your own mega dungeon, mid-size, or even some of the simple dungeons, the sort of modern ones. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to try this with your players. I'm telling you, if it's something out of the box and it has a good storyline and it makes sense, they're going to like it. And if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. I always answer them. And of course, most importantly, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.